we will have covered that section.
We're going to give people a couple minutes to get started, Chris.
Yes.
And if you want to turn your cameras off, we'll give this full screen to the presenters. Well, should we get started, Chris?
Yes, please.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to the Organizational Learning Evaluation Capacity Building webinar for today. My name is Marcela Gutierrez, and I am one of the co-chairs of our TIG, along with Cheryl Enders. And Chris Magnus is here also, a former chair, and she is now acting as our host. So thank you all for coming. Chris is going to be managing the chat box, and also wanted to remind you that we are taping the conversation for transcription. And Chris, we have made available the video version of the webinar also for our TIG members in the past. So this TIG recording, the recording will be archived in the TIG's webpage at AEA. So if you want to watch it again and be reminded of some of the useful tips the presenters are going to share with us, you'll be able to find it there. So with that, I want to turn it over to our presenters, Dr. Carrie Tanasuchuk and Harry Daly from the Greater St. John Community Foundation in Canada. So thank you guys for agreeing to do this. And please, we're looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. We're happy to be here. So this originally was us putting together an abstract for an AEA conference. So in a lovely COVID-free world, we would actually facilitate this workshop, and you could see our facilitation skills by what we do in the room. But that's not reality, and so this is a webinar, and we will be talking at you a lot. But hopefully, we're still sharing some skills on facilitation, and we'll try to make it as interactive as we can through the chat box. But just keeping in mind that's the context for this presentation, and what we would actually prefer to be doing is facilitating in person, but here we are. So our presentation is facilitation skills for evaluation capacity building. Next slide, please. So who are we? So I'm Carrie Tanasuchuk. I'm the Director of Impact Measurement and Evaluation. My co-presenter, who you'll hear from in a little bit, is Harry Daly. He's the Director of Community Investment and Learning at the Community Foundation here in St. John. And you can see a map on the right-hand side. There's a little pin for where St. John is. So New Brunswick, Canada is just above Maine, and we are on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqey First Nation. And so a little bit of background. So I've been doing evaluation for about 16 years or so, primarily in nonprofit, and came to this job with a lot of evaluation experience. Harry came to the foundation with a lot of community development and facilitation experience. And so we really kind of both brought our skill sets and combined them. And that's really where our approach comes from. So the Community Foundation in St. John, we support charitable organizations that are local to our community. So we do that through grants, through giving money, but we also do that through other initiatives, whether that's connecting organizations and volunteers or with other information, or for the last 2 years, we've supported organizations through impact measurement and evaluation capacity building. So what that means is that there's really an expectation now that nonprofits and charities are measuring their impact and they're reporting on their impact and they're telling the story of their impact. Funders have this expectation, donors have this expectation, but there's not always the resources available to help organizations do that. So whether that's time or money or people or even expertise or knowledge about how to do that. And so the Community Foundation really saw this need in the community that these organizations wanted to be able to do this, but they really needed the skills and capacity to be able to do so. And so the Impact Measurement and Evaluation branch of the foundation was formed, and Harry and I were hired to start doing this in the community. And we do that through a variety of ways, through coaching, we have an evaluation course. It's really we work through organizations in a lot of different ways, and but what the common thread is that we're always working on building their capacity and empowering them to do this stuff themselves. So we don't work really as an external consultant who kind of swoop in and evaluate something and write a report and then swoop out. It's really we're going in there and we're working with the organizations to help build up their capacity so they can do it by themselves. Next slide. Okay, so we have 3 objectives for today. So first, we want to explore the importance of facilitation in capacity building. So I'm going to assume most people here at this presentation have some sort of interest in capacity building because you're a member of the TIG. So we're going to talk about why facilitation is important in capacity building. Second, we're going to introduce the approach we use when facilitating sessions. Not the only approach, it's one that we use and we've used for the last 2 years with pretty good success. The third objective is to provide examples of what facilitation looks like in our work. So we're giving you a lot of theory and a lot of little tips and tricks, but then we want to show some examples of what this actually looks like in the real world. So these are our principles. We created them. They're unique to us. They might not be the principles that guide your work, but they're the principles that we feel are important in guiding our work. And actually you can see them, they're on the wall behind me, but so we look at them every day. But I'm not going to go through them in detail. But what you'll see here is that these are the 6 things that are really important to that we really want to show through all the different work we do. We evaluate ourselves on how well we're hitting these principles and how well we're actually doing this. When you look at these 6 principles, though, it really fosters a capacity building approach. So we're working on empowering people. We want to build up these relationships. We want to foster like curiosity and evaluative thinking. And so those things are not impossible to do if you just kind of swoop in and evaluate and then swoop out, but you're probably going to be much more likely to hit on these with a capacity building approach. The other thing to note about these principles is that it's really important to us that we elicit authentic engagement from participants in all of our work. So whatever we're doing, whatever kind of session, however we're working with an organization, what's really important to us is that we really authentically engage with the people that we're forming over these relationships with. And so that's something that we really hold these 6 things near and dear to our hearts when we're planning a facilitated session. Next slide, please. So I want you to think about a workshop or a session or some kind of event, some learning event that you've been to that felt really good. So I want you to think about, oh yeah, that session I went to and it felt really good. What were some of the characteristics of that session? You can just put it in the chat box really quickly. I'm just curious. You could think about a time you went to a session or some sort of event or meeting and it just felt really good, and you left there and you go, you know, that just felt really good. What were some of the characteristics that come to mind? And just put them in the chat box. Interactive, yeah, absolutely. Structure balanced with flexibility, responsiveness, engaging, challenge thinking. That's good. Encourage us that we could perform better. Relatable, yep. Talking, collaborating, listening. Different ways of seeing stuff, multiple folks participating and sharing, knowing your audience, that's a really good one. Participating in different ways, whatever feels good for you. Absolutely. So thank you, everyone. You can keep putting those in the chat box if you want to, and people can read them. But the there's a lot of common threads there, and that's what we'll touch on today. Is really we want to have a session that makes people leave feeling good, and they're like, oh, I feel really good about how that went. So a facilitation guide is really a roadmap. You can think of it as a roadmap. You want to get people where they want to go and get what you want from them. So you're thinking about the people, how do I get them where they want to go, and how do I get what I want from them? And so next slide, please, Harry. So this is a little bit different than planning a meeting. So when you're planning a meeting, you're probably going to plan some sort of an agenda. And typically what an agenda is it's topics I want to make sure we cover in this meeting. So topics for discussion. It's not to say meetings and agendas are always terrible. That's absolutely not true. They have their time and their place, but it's different than planning a facilitated session. So a facilitated session, you're really going to put the people in the meeting first. You're really going to think about who's in the room. And it's going to be a facilitation guide is essentially a detailed plan for how to elicit authentic reflection and insights from the people in the room. So again, going back to some of the things we heard in the chat about knowing your audience, who's in the room, we want to give people ways to participate and make it interactive and engaging. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Harry, who's going to get a little bit more into the nuts and bolts of how to make that happen.
Thanks, Carrie. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon here, wherever you are joining from. Hopefully you're having a good day. So as Carrie mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the process that we use when we're approaching a facilitated session. And so what we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about is the ASPIRE model. And so this is a model that was created by the Tatamagouche Center, which is in Nova Scotia, Canada. It's a center that's really renowned for the facilitated sessions that they do, some really personal and socially transformative sessions and work that comes out of that organization. And over the past 20 years, they've developed this model that they call the ASPIRE model. And so it is pretty near and dear to our heart. It is something that we use when planning any session. I've kind of integrated into my life. It's just the way that I look at the world. I'm very process oriented, so it's a tool that works very well for me. And so the ASPIRE model is an acronym. So that stands for, the A is assessment. The S is a bit of a sneaky one, set objectives, but really about objectives there. The P is for plan. I for implement, R for reflect, and E for evaluate. And so the ASPIRE model kind of rolls through this in a sequence. For the person that just asked, it is the Tatamagouche Center. So maybe Carrie, if you wanted to type that into the chat for people, not a name you're probably heard before, familiar with. So Tatamagouche Center. So what I'm going to do is just kind of walk through this. For context, I participated in a 5-day in-person kind of you stay there at the center training on this. We're going to breeze through it in about 10 minutes. So certainly the tip of the iceberg, but hopefully you can get a few takeaways, and we'll have a slide at the end with some information if you are interested in that more detailed training. So the first thing we want to talk about, and if there's anything that I could hope that you take away from today, it is the information on this slide, because I think that it really does differentiate between a regular meeting in the way that I had previously approached the work that I did, and then was introduced to the ASPIRE model, and it really started to shift the way that I think. And it's quite simple, but it was a real light bulb moment for me, and we've seen a lot of benefits with the organizations that we work with. And so we're going to kind of quickly cover the A and the S of ASPIRE. So the assessment. And so the assessment is trying to figure out about your audience as much as you can know about them before you start or while you're working with them. So a big part of it is, where are they now? So to the best of your ability, trying to understand your audience before you even touch base with them or have them in that session. So what do you know about your audience? What don't you know about your audience? So what are some things that you might need to find out about them around where they are now, what they're bringing, what their hopes are for the session? So finding out as much information and really putting them at the forefront of any planning that you do. So who's going to show up to your meeting, and then why are they there, which is number 2. So where do they want to be? So again, you have to try to figure out where your group is. And then a separate question is, where do they want to be? How do they hope to change? What do they want to take away from your session? What assets or barriers might they have to achieving this? So by framing that conversation before you start planning, what do you want to do? Because that tends to be the way that we think is, what are we going to do? What are the activities we're going to do? But by first doing this assessment and looking as much as possible, where are they now? And where do they want to be? You're then well set up to ask your third question, which is around set objectives. How can we make that happen? So when we think about facilitation, we're thinking about how can we help someone, that group, get from where they are now to where they want to be. And so you let them guide that. Sometimes, if we're doing capacity building around evaluation, there's some information or skills that we want them to achieve that they might not previously have known about. So you certainly can't take yourself and what you hope to give them away from that equation. But it's really about filling that gap. So where they are, where they want to be, how can we make that happen? How do we bridge that gap? And that's where we set objectives. And so like you saw at the beginning of this session, we had 3 objectives that stemmed from our assessment of the group. We didn't really know that much about it. Just as an example, we kind of thought maybe there'd be 10 or 15 people and there's over 100 registered. And then of course you get about 40 people showing up, and we just found that out yesterday. So that really dramatically changes the way that we were approaching this. So the more that you can find out, the more that you can ask in advance, the better. So this is kind of the A and the S, the assessment, and then set objectives accordingly. And using those objectives, so how you can make that happen, is the cornerstone for everything else that you do. Again, this seems very simple and straightforward, but I challenge you the next time you're in a planning session thinking about what you're going to do for an activity, how quickly it switches to what are we going to do. So before you've considered who's going to be there, what are we going to do? And I think that that's, in my opinion, one of the biggest differences between facilitating a session and just having a meeting is taking these things into consideration. So the P of Aspire is plan, and Carrie touched on this a little bit, but kind of looking at the difference between an agenda and a guide. So an agenda is what you're going to cover. So what are we going to do? What are the topics that we are going to talk about? And I think we've all been in meetings or sessions where you maybe ask a question and it goes in an assortment of different directions. You kind of lose control of that conversation in a way, and it doesn't necessarily get you further towards where you want this group to be or where you think that they want to get, and it detracts from that. And so what we use is a facilitation guide, like Carrie mentioned. And what this is a bit of it's a roadmap, not just about what you're going to do, but how you're going to do it. So it's a very detailed plan about each individual activity. We have one in front of us right now that we use. Happy to share the template, but it's basically a really thorough breakdown of what you're going to do, why you're going to be doing that, and how you're going to be doing it. And the most important piece to remember about this plan is that it relates back directly to the objectives. So at the beginning of this, I don't know if you can see it, but at the beginning of today's, we have that assessment and objectives right at the top, so that everything that we do links back to what those objectives are. So when we come up with a guide, and we facilitate a lot of different sessions on a lot of different topics for wide, very diverse groups of people, but we do tend to follow a flow. So we're not starting from scratch every time. The objectives and the assessments obviously going to be unique to each individual. But the flow that we usually go with kind of has some bookends that we stick with. And the first thing that we'd like to always do is a welcome and a check-in to really bring people into the space, kind of knock them, shake off whatever they walked into the room with or sat down in front of their computer with. So a check-in piece, and we'll talk about that in a second. The other thing that we always do is share the objectives. So we don't always share the assessment that we've done in the background, but we do share the objectives so that we can say, this is what we're going to do today. And one thing about the objectives, I guess, that I didn't mention was that if there's any evaluators here, this isn't the outcomes. This isn't the change we hope that people experience. The objectives are what we have control over. So this is what we're going to do. So often we'll use language like, we're going to introduce this topic, or we're going to explore this concept, or we're going to create the space too. And we have control over that. We can make sure that we do those things. We can't always control the change that elicits in the participants, but we can certainly have some creative control over how we that we actually do present that and do what we say we're going to do. So we put those up front with the objectives. We also tend to do community standards or a team contract. So that happens in a lot of different ways. Quite often we'll work with a group over a series of sessions. So it's a really great way up front to figure out, it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the work that we do. And it's a little countercultural to ask people, you know, what type of atmosphere do you want to create while we're here? What do you hope to give and get? You know, how are we going to handle conflict? And sometimes those questions can be a little bit jarring, but to address them before they initially, group norm, somebody else calls them, exactly, taking the time to do that every time, just the process of doing that can be really, it just sets the tone. It's a good practice, and then it also gets ahead of the curve because initially, like inevitably, conflict arises, especially if you're doing some participatory decision making. That those personalities will show their heads. So. Then what we do is kind of initiatives, that's the implement. So depending on your session, that's going to look different for each one. And we have some really good resources about that we'll share at the end. And then on the other end of the session, when we're planning it, is we always put a reflection at the end, which we'll talk about, and an evaluation. So that's the R and the E of Aspire. So reflection and evaluation, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But generally, we're not starting from scratch. We kind of follow that flow for each session, no matter what we do. So some really quick ideas for group warm-ups. I'm sure there's varying levels of experience with facilitation here, but some that we kind of fall back on that we really like it. So a question that we'll ask at the beginning is really good for groups that know each other. What's the story behind your name? So how did you get your first name? So quite often that's a question that if a group of people knows each other really well, if you're working with an organization that spends a lot of time with each other, it's a really good question to, just kind of shake people up. A lot of people haven't heard it before. It usually works pretty well. Know that everybody gets their name in different ways, and so depending on the group, that can be a traumatic experience for some people to receive a name that maybe that they have negative associations with. So it is important to ask or to consider that in your assessment. You know, don't just jump right in with that question without considering who's going to be on the receiving end of that question. Really simple thing that we'll do with virtual presentations. What's something you see outside your window or nearby? What's the most memorable moment from the last week? Those are really quick, you know, we call them icebreakers. We tend to call them like group warm-ups because people don't like the word icebreaker, but anything that brings people out of like just that moment, as long as it's not too silly right out of the gate. And again, know your audience. That's the most important part. Maybe that's exactly what people need, is something silly. But another thing that we do, we put it here in quotes, speed dating. So that's when you have a larger group of people. So say you have 20 different people in the room, and we set that up so that people can meet each other really quick. So we'll have 2 circles and they're in pairs facing each other. And so then you'd have 10 questions if there's 20 people. You ask one question, they have 10 minutes or about 2 minutes to answer it. Then you have some type of like sound that they move on to the next participant. You ask them a different question, and that really quickly over the course of maybe 15 or 20 minutes, they get introduced to each person in the room. And you can always just hear, I really love the awkward silence that comes when people first sit down in a meeting, they don't really know each other. And then you go through something like speed dating and they're all talking to each other and the energy in the room is totally different. And that's when you know you're ready to dive into some deeper conversation and work. When it comes to actually facilitating and planning what you're going to do, something that we rely on and Carrie knows a lot about is active learning. So these are the 4 C's of active learning. It is hard for us to give you specific examples of facilitation activities to use, not knowing what you're going to be facilitating or your audiences, but these are kind of the 4 C's that we always try to keep in mind no matter what. So that's creativity, which is the mental space and freedom to open up thinking and engage in new ideas. Critical thinking, which increases engagement and promotes self-led learning and transforming someone's thinking. Opportunities for collaboration, so individually or small groups, and then communication, so that they're built around various forms of communication. And if you think back to some of the things that you said stood out about good, well-facilitated sessions, I think a lot of those are going to fall under these different categories here. So keeping these 4 C's in mind when you're doing your planning, really important. Lots of cheat sheets for this. We'll share some examples of books that we rely on heavily that we can kind of go to that have these integrated into their activities, so you don't have to come up with new ideas and reinvent the wheel every time. There's a lot of people that do this for a living and are happy to share what they do. So we'll share a few of our go-to tips and tricks. So experiential learning, this would be the R of the Aspire model, so the reflection. So once you've gone through your entire session, you've covered a lot of ground, you've introduced some new skills or knowledge, gone through some process with them. What we always do is have a reflection at the end, and that's an opportunity for someone to ask, what just happened here? Why does that matter? And what are you going to do with that now? And so this experiential learning cycle, some people might be familiar with, but it's basically that flow. So it's stopping and giving the participants the opportunity at the end of your session to stop and verbally or written or even to just think about it if they're not up for talking anymore, to just think about what just happened here, what stood out to you. Why do you think that stood out to you, and what can you do with that moving forward? And by building that into every session, that's where that capacity building really happens, because that's when they're learning. That's when they become a little bit of a different person and can take something with them. You can't just expect people to do that. We've all been to sessions, and this might be one of them for you, that you're like, yeah, there were some really good things in there, and then you get on with your day and it's all gone. So by taking this little moment in each session to do that, it does solidify that. As a facilitator, it's also great because you get to hear, what stood out to people. And even though everyone's gone through the same session, generally speaking, people identify a different what. And it can also feed into your assessment. So what stood out to you? The next time you're planning a session, you get a better idea of what's standing out to people. Some different ways that so someone asked here, how much time would you put aside for a reflection? Depends on the size of the group. Usually, most of the things that we facilitate are somewhere in the realm of 10 to 15 people. And so usually we'd set aside about 10 minutes for that. Some different ways that we elicit a final reflection from people. The really simple, what stood out to you and why? So just asking that question, and you'll go around in a circle and people have the option to share or pass. If you just ask the group, people won't generally jump all over it. Sometimes they will, but if you're sitting in a circle or you pass something around so that everybody has the opportunity to share, that's a really good way to encourage the sharing. One of our favorites, apple and onion. So we bring a physical apple and an onion with us at the end of the session, and we say, we're going to pass the apple and onion around. The apple is something that you bit into. It was really sweet. You really liked it from the session. It was easy to like. The onion is something that if you bite into an onion, probably doesn't taste the greatest. Everybody's into different things, but for the most part, people don't just eat an onion straight up. But if you take an onion home, you chop it up, put it in some oil, heat it up a little bit with some garlic and some oil, simmer it for a little while. It might have some use for you down the road. It might taste a little bit better. So what you're looking for there is something that really stood out that's good, something that maybe the person didn't like, but you're encouraging them to think about why they didn't like it and how they might put it to use in the future. When you physically pass around something around the room too, people will look at it. It makes them a little more comfortable instead of just kind of standing up and sharing that with the group. So that's one of our favorites. And then I wish, I wonder. You just ask them to finish those statements. What did you like? What do you wish? What do you wonder? So those are just 3 simple things that you could do at the end of a session to help people dive into their learning a little bit more. The R of Aspire reflection is around that participants learning. So you're taking the opportunity for them to dive deeper into their own personal learning. The E of Aspire is evaluate. So that's evaluating how well this session met the objectives. So the Aspire model is a spiral, and the evaluate is right across from the objective. So what you're looking for there is, did the facilitators, did Carrie and I meet those objectives in a way that worked for you? So lots of different ways that you can do that. You could have the objectives written down on a flip chart in the room and give them a green, yellow, and red dot, and they can go up and say, yep, met that one, didn't meet that one, don't even think you talked about that. Gives you a bit of a superficial understanding of whether you met your objectives. Some other ways that we've done that, we host a lot of kind of conversation cafes where you will set the room up to make it look like a cafe. Sometimes we'll have the learning menus, we call them, and we dress up like we're servers and really set the scene for some deeper conversation that people can get really interactive around a concept. And then we'll have we'll act it out that this is a pop-up, and this is a pop-up conversation cafe, and then we'll give out a TripAdvisor review where they can write a star and what stood out to them and why. So you can really get as creative as you need to, but the important difference there is the reflection is asking them questions that help them dive deeper into their own learning. The evaluate is about evaluating your role as a facilitator, as getting them from A to B, so where they were to where they want to be. And something I like to say around facilitation is that the root word of that is from facile, which is to make easy. So your role as a facilitator is to make that process easy, to get them from where they are to where they want to be, and to do that as easily as possible. And the evaluate is the opportunity for you to ask if that was easy for them, and then improve. And that also works as a good assessment tool if you're going to be working with them in the future.
Thanks, Harry. So now we're going to go through 3 examples of how this shows up in our work and what this can look like. Like we said, we work with a lot of different groups in a lot of different ways. So these are just 3 examples that we want to go through. Next slide, please. So the first thing to talk about is evaluate your impact course. So that's an 8-session intro course designed for non-evaluators. So those 8 sessions are generally every 2 weeks. So it's actually a 4-month course, and we meet every 2 weeks with some homework between the sessions. And I think someone asked a question about virtual facilitation, and I'll get a little bit into that as I talk about this course. So we've offered this course twice now. The first time was a particularly heavy moment for COVID in our area, and so most of it was virtual, and we weren't intending that at all when we first designed the course, and so we did have to shift gears and deliver that virtually the first time, and the second time we offered it, it was mostly in person. But let me back up and about the course planning though, and so I come from an academic background. I've taught undergraduate courses, and so the first thing I would, we can do a course. Let me develop a syllabus, and I'll think about my lecture notes, but it's quite a different thing when you're not lecturing like 100 undergraduate students, and you really want to facilitate some learning and actual useful learning for non-evaluators, and most of which are adults who may or may not have been in school for quite some time. And so we've developed facilitation guides for every single session. So not lecture notes, so you weren't thinking of it that way, but thinking about going through that process, the Aspire process, and thinking about what do we know about the people taking the course. We do have a pre-course interview with all of the people that have enrolled, so we can learn about what their goals are, why they're taking it, what their interest is. So that helps us with the assessment piece. We do objective setting for each of our sessions. So we think about where are they now, where do they want to be at the end of the session? How are we going to get them there? So if this week we're learning about theory of change and logic models, what do they need to know, and how can we get them there? And then we do the check-in and the warm-up every class, but then we think about activities. So there is some information sharing, like we're more of like a lecture style where we're sharing information on slides, but there are also a lot of interactive activities. So for example, in our theory of change and our logic model session, they have a description, a little bio of a Lego person, and it describes this person and where they are in their life, and okay, so use this Lego and design a house for them, and then we talk about how their life has changed because of this house. And so not to get into too much detail with that one activity, but those are an example of things where we could just lecture about logic models or the theory of change, but that may or may not be that effective in actually building their capacity. We have the hands-on active learning, and we get much more of like the critical thinking and the collaboration, and it really seems to stick with people a lot better. And someone asked about, do course participants generally come to us in teams from the same organization? Typically, no. We have had a couple of ones where they happen to be the same organization, but generally this is working professionals in the nonprofit sector who may know each other, they may not know each other, and we really form that community over these 8 sessions. And so those things like Harry was talking about, like the community standards, thinking about how we want to, the group norms, really important. And we do take quite a bit of time on that in our first session to really create this community of learning, because that's so important to us. Next slide, please, Harry. So the next one I'll talk about is a project we did with 5 neighborhood organizations here in St. John. These neighborhood organizations are located in neighborhoods in our city with high rates of poverty. So they're dealing with complex problems, not well, like underfunded. They do a lot with what they can do with what they have, but really, like, these organizations are just going above and beyond and doing tremendous things with some people in some very difficult circumstances. And so this was a year-long project that was designed to work with these organizations and develop the capacity to help them tell their story. And so these neighborhood organizations were very clear that they weren't interested in someone external coming in. Are you doing a good job or not? A good job or a bad job? I'm going to write you my report, and I'm going to leave. And these neighborhood organizations are left with a report and not much else, maybe some recommendations. What they really wanted to be able to do is have tools so that they could tell their own story. They could ask their own questions and find out the answers and measure their impact and on a continual basis, not a one-time thing, and have these essentially be able to tell their story about why they're so important to the community. It would have been easier, I suppose, if Harry and I, there were some times where I'll be frank, this project really like pushed us, I think, as professionals, and it was really fun and rewarding, but it was also challenging in some ways, because like I said, there were 5 organizations working in 5 different neighborhoods, and they all have their own realities and contexts and idiosyncrasies, and just figuring out a way to give everybody what they needed, and how to get everyone from, if you think about like the step 1 to that arrow that went over here, how do we get everyone over here, and we don't want to leave anyone behind. And so it would have been a lot easier sometimes for us to just be like, okay, like we'll just go and survey these residents for you, or we'll just go and collect this data for you. But what would have been the final implications of that? Then we would have left and they wouldn't have been able to do it themselves. They wouldn't have built up that capacity. And so we took a year and we really worked. We rolled up our sleeves and worked with a lot of different levels of staff in the organizations, from frontline staff up to the executive directors, and really said, okay, like let's build up your capacity to be able to tell your story and to measure your impact in ways that work for you. So it wasn't ways that would work for us. It was what works for you as an organization. Like, what resources do you have? What programs do you offer? How can we embed evaluation into what you're already doing and just kind of bake it in? So it's not this another thing on a very long to-do list that you have. Next slide, please, Harry. So the third one, it's not really one project because we've done this quite a bit, but theory of change workshops. And so if you spend much time in evaluation, you probably run theory of change workshops yourself. And so again, it's really thinking about where are the people that are going to be in this session, where are they now, and where do they need to be, and how will we get them there? And typically, where they need to be or where they want to be is to have a theory of change. And so how can we figure that out, and how can we engage people authentically? And so what we've done, I mean, we've had sessions with everyone from board members and executive directors to maintenance staff all in the same room. And so a board member might have a very high level view of an organization. An executive director might have really detailed understanding of all the different aspects of this organization and how it operates and everything that's going on. A member of a maintenance staff might just, what they're thinking about is their particular role. And so how do you make that session engaging for everyone in order to have everyone contribute? So we go through the Aspire process, plan activities around that, and how can we get everyone to contribute? And what's really neat is that this, so for example, we had a member of a cleaning crew that was in a session, and at first this person was thinking like, well, I don't know why I'm here. I don't contribute to the organization, like other than like cleaning up. Like I don't really have anything to do with the outcomes or how we achieve our vision. But then as the session progressed and as we got people to share and get to be involved in the process, we were talking about community building and how this particular organization throws a big Christmas party for the neighborhood, and the kids come in and they get like Christmas pajamas, and it's quite an important thing to the community. And the cleaning person said, well, I don't do much. I just put up the decorations. And everyone in the room turned to this person and said, like, that is so important. Like, we need the community comes in here and they see like the lights and the garland, and it's really magical, and that's really important. And so by the end, this person who came in there and said, well, I don't know why I'm here, I just clean, said like, oh no, like I'm helping by doing these things, and these things are really important to the organization. So that's just one example of how we really think about how can we get the people in the room to where they want to be, and you have to think about who's in the room and how do we get everyone over across that bridge that Harry talked about. Next one. So if we were in person in a room, it'd be lovely to have an apple and an onion, or like to go around the room and do a sharing circle, but we're not. And so what we'd ask people is what stood out to you from today's presentation? You can just type your answer in the chat box. We'd love to hear. So that's again that piece of that reflection of the Aspire model. So what stood out to you from today? Real life examples. The process to use to approach facilitation, different ways of learning, difference between a meeting and a facilitated session, definitely. You know, it's interesting, the person who said the process to use for facilitation before, like I remember about 10 years ago, I was in a job and I went to a really well facilitated session. And I remember saying to my coworker, like, I don't know, like facilitators are just, they're magic. Like, I don't, this is just magic. I don't know how they do this. And she said to me, like, no, there's like a process they follow. Like, there's a way to do it. It's not just, you don't just have to have this magic touch. And so definitely learning the process, I think, makes it a little less mystical and sounds a little more doable. New icebreaker questions, definitely embedding opportunities to reflect. Great. Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate that. Next slide, please, Harry. So these are some resources these will get sent out to you. So the Aspire training Harry mentioned is offered through the Tatamagouche Center in Nova Scotia. And then there's some books that we rely on quite a bit. And like Harry said, there's
if you want to.
Yeah, sure.
I use these things like every day, all the time, very process oriented. So usually what we'll do is kind of go through that assessment and set objectives piece before we start thinking about what we want to do, because like we said a few times, if you start with what you want to do and work backwards, sometimes that can work against you and the people in the room. But once you've done your assessment, you've set your objectives, usually I will open up one of these two books. Lately, my go-to has been Game Storming. It's been around for a while, but it is full of really detailed plans. There's got to be over 100 different activities of how to get people, where they want to go or to get information out of them. Some of them are quite simple, and it's still, we've been using it for a number of years, and it's still very surprising how well they work. Just by giving people a little bit of a process that's outside of the normal way that they would have conversations. Usually people want something different, but are apprehensive about doing things in a different way. But when you do provide them with the space to do that, it's quite incredible. The the ideas that can come out of people. And then the Facilitator's Guide to Participatory Decision Making, that's really around, when there is decisions to be made. So not just information to be communicated, but when you're working with the group to make some really tough decisions, maybe that's around strategy, a theory of change, whatever the case may be. This is full of great theory and also really practical examples of how to jump into that. And then The Surprising Power of Liberating Structures, another great book with some really good ideas. The basic premise of that is that, if you have an alphabet, and they say that our current alphabet of meetings is kind of like brainstorming, open conversation, a presentation, I forget the fourth one, but those are kind of the four traditional ways that we would approach things. Those are the four letters of the alphabet, and how unfortunate it is that there's so many more words, so much more that could open up if we had more letters for our alphabet. And so what it does is kind of introduce different concepts that they talk about as adding letters to that alphabet, so that you can really open up what people have the ability to communicate in their sessions. So Surprising Power of Liberating Structures, another great book.
May I take a minute to ask you both, would you be willing to provide the slides to our participants?
Oh, of
Okay,
course,
everybody, they're willing to provide the slides, just so that we all know. Thank you.
And then finally, so we don't, the final E is evaluate. We don't have an evaluation to pass out to you, but if anything like really stood out to you as great, or you're like, I got a bone to pick with you people, here are emails. You can or any questions or anything like that we don't get to in the question period, please feel free to contact either Harry or myself. And then I guess we are done, so we can open it up to questions. I'm not sure, Marcella, Chris, how you usually run your Q&A session.
Thank you, guys. I already have my hand up. And since I'm the facilitator, I will go with my first question. But obviously, it's open to everybody. I know that beyond the chat, people will want to comment and hear your answers. My biggest challenge, I think it's been when I'm doing evaluation capacity building, is with the critical thinking piece. People are just not used to questions that kind of make them have to think about something. They're waiting for me to give them the answers. And instead, when I turn it around and say, well, what do you think a theory is? What is an assumption? And they have to come up with their own definition. It's like they freeze. And that's just an example. I've taught evaluation classes, and my students have said, well, you're not going to cover what we read in the book. And I said, well, no, because here's where you show me that you understand what you learn in the book. So how do you deal with that? How do you, create this level of comfort where people feel like there's no right or wrong, and they overcome their fear of, really thinking and putting some ideas out?
One thing, so in the community standards that Harry mentioned, one thing that usually typically comes up is people want to feel free to express ideas. And one thing that we usually add to that is that if an idea is just kind of half cooked in your mind and you're like, I'm not really sure where I'm going with this, but I'm just going to say what I kind of think and see where it goes, that's okay, because that's typically how I just kind of start talking and rambling, and sometimes I get to where I'm going, sometimes I don't, but that's okay. Another thing that we typically do, and here I'll open up to you after I finish this, is that giving people different ways to participate. So one thing we usually do when we do some activities where it's like this, for example, like what do you think a theory is, or what do you think an assumption is, is have a worksheet that they can fill out individually or on stickies or something like that, and have something where someone can gather their thoughts and just write it out individually. And then typically what we do is put them with another person, or maybe in a group of 3, so either a group of 2 or a 3, to kind of talk about what they wrote down. And then what we usually do is bring the larger group together, and then that group can share their ideas. And so at that point, they've thought about it individually, they've gathered their thoughts, they've written them down, they've talked about it with 1 or 2 other people, which might not seem so intimidating as just getting in front of a group and saying, I think a theory is this. And then having an opportunity for the group to share back what they talked about. So it's not one person saying, well, I said this, but it's the group saying, oh, like, here's a thing that we all talked about. And I'll turn it over to you, Harry, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, and I just put in the chat that we kind of did that just naturally. I don't think it's too uncommon for people to take that approach, but 1, 2, 4 all is an example of something from the liberating structures, and it's just the way. So one, the individual does it, then they pair up with someone, then those pairs get together and talk, and then everybody shares back. So there's a lot of information on that process called 1, 2, 4 all. Another thing that we'll often do, especially around words. So there was one that we were, they wanted to create a food security network in Charlotte County, which is an area here. And so before we really dove into how that might happen, we went through each of those words individually. So create, what does create mean to you? And everybody had the opportunity to think about that. What does food mean to you? What does network mean to you? So really trying to get people on the same page about that, and having that done individually, and then people share up. So then you have this big long list of words that helps describe what those words are and gets people on the same page about some of those abstract concepts before you even get going. But again, using the same method, getting people the opportunity to think about it on their own. Not everybody is comfortable talking in a group. And so the more we use a lot of sticky notes, we definitely use a lot of paper. It's not very efficient or environmentally friendly often, but no matter how people communicate it, as long as there's a way that we can capture that moving forward, and in some cases it's just about people thinking about it. Critical thinking doesn't have to happen out loud, right? They can, if they're there, they're thinking about it. Giving them the space to do that is really important.
So there's been a question by a gentleman who wanted to know, in these sessions, how do you deal with a person that has really strong biases? So they come in and they have really strong biases, and so hard to shift issues like that.
Yeah, so we're doing, I mean, there's no, it would be very situational for sure. I think, again, things like the team contract, how are we going to communicate? How will we react when conflict arises? Doing that up front before that happens is best. On Friday, we're hosting a session for a group that we're working with once a month for 3 hours. And from the participatory decision-making book that I shared, there's an activity called Communication Styles That Bug People. And that's this big long list of communication styles that bug people. And so we sent that yesterday as the pre-reading. There's no communication styles that bug people that we know of yet, though we're sure that they will come out. But rather than reacting to that, and then it kind of feels awkward and that person's called out, we get ahead of the curve, send that out, everybody reads the same information, and then when we meet, there's an activity like, which one of these bug you? Which one of these do you do that probably bugs other people? How does that make you feel? How can we react? And people can kind of like joke about it a little bit up front, rather than, and they'll naturally come out, but we do have a lot of deep work. It's a very collaborative project that we're working on, and inevitably people have extreme biases towards their organizations, and it's going to get tricky. But I think hopefully by doing some activities like that up front, you get ahead of the curve.
And so everybody there, both reading and responding. And so please, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. The one thing I would like to ask is, do you have any books or articles or anything that you've used to be inclusive of our individuals that are either extremely hard of hearing or are visually impaired? The visually impaired, I think, is a more difficult way to make sure that they are engaged. And also with the hard of hearing, I know that we are very responsive in AEA, but we just haven't focused very much on that. And how do we get that population to become more? And I think we're going to see more of it after the outcome of COVID and people who are struggling with long COVID.
That's a really good point, and not something that we've dealt particularly with in this role, like in this, as this has existed for 2 years. One thing we do ask in our pre-course assessment is if there's any sort of like accommodations or the things that people want us to know about the way they learn or anything like that. So that could be like something like it could be like neurodivergencies. It could be like low vision, I suppose. We do try to make sure like our slides and stuff have are a little more friendly to the eyes. However, that doesn't really help if you're so visually impaired that you wouldn't be able to see the slides. So it's not something that we've dealt with in these past 2 years. Harry, I'm curious because you've had more facilitation experience with me. Has that come up for you?
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't, to be totally honest. So I don't have any suggested articles or processes for that. One thing that I can say that we always do is to try to make ourselves as approachable as possible before, during, and after the session. So always we offer up time. Something with the course that we did is we kind of had office hours, even when it was online. So we were always available at a particular time to dive a little bit deeper into some of that stuff. So if somebody it wasn't understanding a concept for whatever that reason that might be, maybe they were just checked out at the moment, but maybe there were some visual or hearing impairments that were leading to that we try to make ourselves as approachable as possible so that it's not like this is the only time you have us and see you next time. So I think that the more that you can make yourself approachable so that people are comfortable sharing and working with them once they have shared to accommodate whatever they need. But in terms of really specific, tangible, like here's a book to reference, unfortunately, I do not have anything on hand.
No, I really appreciate you both addressing that. Thank you.
I have another question. This is Marcella again. I was curious, you mentioned in the theory of change example that you had board members, executive directors, staff at all levels together in the room. And I wonder how you manage the dynamics of the different ranks and, levels of power, internal levels of power to generate a truthful discussion when some people are intimidated, when they have their direct supervisor or their ED or a board member in front, participating in the same group and being honest about what you think is an issue with the organization. So I wonder how you manage those dynamics in mixed groups like that.
Oh, that's such a good point, and it's something that we do talk about in assessment quite a bit. And it comes up in the theory of change workshops. It comes up in this project that Harry mentioned that we're facilitating on Friday, actually, and that there's multiple people from organizations, and often it's one person is someone, the other person is supervisor. And so a lot of times in things we facilitate, there is power imbalances, and that is something we typically talk about during the assessment, and just naming that and thinking about what that could influence. Typically, like, it kind of depends on the personalities too. Like we've been in sessions where the ED's there and then the frontline staff are there, and I don't think that many of the frontline staff would have a problem saying what they thought. And then sometimes you're like, oh, they might not, that person might not actually feel very comfortable. So it is being just aware that it exists. I don't have a magic fix to get rid of power imbalances. I wish I did, but I think just being aware of it. And we've even said it out loud to a group, like, look, we understand, like, you might be with somebody in your group that is your supervisor or whatever it is, but let's just try to all feel free to like say what we think. And just naming it, I think honestly helps a lot. And then giving like going back to like where people have a chance to write things out individually so that they don't have to say it to their supervisor or whoever that is, but they have an opportunity to write out what they think. Harry, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just ditto everything that you said. I think that, with that theory of change example, in that particular session, it was more about what is happening, not what's not happening, and evaluating that. So I think, again, in that assessment, just being really not diving into some potentially confrontational issue right out of the gate, and if there are going to be something where there's a power dynamic or power imbalance, really providing lots of different ways for people to share what they feel, so that it doesn't have to like, okay, you two get together and talk this out. Really trying to make sure that if you want authentic engagement from each of those individuals, to provide an opportunity for them to do that, maybe individually, not have to say it out loud, and just really trying to be aware of that, and hopefully not just leading with that, right? Like getting the group to a place where a conversation about power imbalances is appropriate. That can take some time. Some, like some situations we have the ability to take that time, and in other situations we don't. So I think it's really important to ensure that you're cognizant of that, and don't make assumptions that people want to talk about certain things and that's going to be easy for them.
Okay, well, we're almost out of time, so I wanted to thank both of you for sharing your knowledge and your ideas and your tips with us, your resources. This is going to be definitely an opportunity to go and get deeper into some of the things that you share with us. I really appreciate it. I want to take this opportunity to remind those of you who are still with us that the proposal timeline for AEA for this year is upon us in April. So if you're thinking of, going for something in proposing something under the OL-ECB topical interest group, we'd really like to get your proposals. We hope to have a wonderful in-person conference. And we also invite those of you who are not ready for a conference, but would like to do a webinar like this, or you maybe tried to present last year, but didn't get a chance because of the reduced number of presentations they had, to let us know, let me know. And I will see, we'll try to accommodate you. We're trying to do, these webinars once a month, once every 2 months. But if you have a topic that you think will be useful and interesting, please let me know. Again, for those of us who join us later, this webinar has been recorded. The videotape and the transcript will be available in our TIG webpage within the AA webpage. So please feel free to go there and get these resources after this. Anything else, Chris?
No, I can't think of anything. I think you guys did a great job. Thank you so much for giving all of us something to look forward to this week. And I'm sure that you'll see many of us going forth and using and ordering those books.
Yes. Thank you again.
Great. Thank you for
and
having
everybody, have a safe and great day. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.